Hi, everyone. My name is Katie Adams. I'm the Director of Annual Giving at the George Eastman Museum. Thank you all for joining us virtually this afternoon. We will get started with our talk on our Machines of Memory cataloging and digitization project shortly, but I did just want to take a minute to thank all of you for being Eastman Museum members. Your support makes all of our work possible, and we are grateful for your commitment, so thank you. Before we get started, I have just a few housekeeping items related to today's program. We invite and encourage you to ask questions at any point during the talk. At the bottom of your Zoom screens, you should see an icon for Q&A. So if you click this, you can submit your questions at any point, and we will go over some of them as time allows at the end of the program. So including questions, we expect the program to last about 45 minutes to 1 hour. The chat function is the other icon at the bottom of your screen, and it is open. So if you are having any technical difficulties, please feel free to let us know through that channel. Or if you just want to say hello and let us know where you're logging in from, we would love to hear from you. Closed captioning is also available for this program. You can click the live transcript button to turn closed captioning on or off. And last, we are recording today's program, so if you'd like to watch it again, or if you want to share it with friends and family, or if you need to leave early, it will be available online in our members-only Vimeo library in the next week or two, and we will let you know when it is. So with all of that out of the way, I will turn things over to Todd Gustavson, Technology Curator at the George Eastman Museum, to get us started. Take it away, Todd.
Well, thank you, Katie. And again, thanks for all the members who've decided to Zoom in today. So just as a heads up, this is I don't know how many Zoom talks I've done, but I'm actually doing this one from my office. So it's a new experience here. So I won't have any dog barking interruptions. So it should be kind of fun. So first of all, we would like to thank the IMLS, the Institute of Museum and Library Services, for making this possible. We actually received a grant from them to catalog and digitize the Cine collection that we have here. And this is Cine equipment. This is probably one of the more important collections actually in the world of this sort of material, and you'll see a little bit of that as we go by. So first of all, I'd like to introduce you to our cataloging team, if you would. We've got Damian Spader, he's the cataloger, and we have Glenn Galbraith, who is the collection manager. So we're working in tandem to kind of get the items out of the vault and get them cataloged, and then they get to move over to our studio. Ira Stroll is the photographer, and you can see him working with his 61 megapixel Sony camera. We take about 10 views of each object, and then it's transferred from the camera to a computer system using Capture One software, and then we actually end up storing it on our server here for both for our database and for future use. So it's been kind of an interesting project, and again, the first cataloging project of this type for the technology collection. So just to get started, for those of you who are out of town and have never been here, this is what the George Eastman Museum looks like. This is the house, actually. This was taken with a pinhole camera, believe it or not, about last year in the early spring. That was one of my photographs, by the way. And of course, the George Eastman House is on the National Historic Register of Historic Sites and has been so since 1966. You may not have seen this plaque if you've been here. It's actually on the side porte cochere entrance of the house. During our COVID lockdown era, we made some changes. We built a new welcome center to the museum, which is what it looks like here. And we also now have a Kodak Colorama image by Stephen Kelly on the side here. The new entrance is adjacent to the Dryden Theater, and this gives us a convenient way to actually get into the museum and the theater at the same time if we so choose. And another quick look inside, we redid the cafe, really quite nice. This is the entrance to the theater. Of course, seeing we're talking motion picture equipment, this is the projection booth in our theaters, which has been upgraded over the years. We can do digital also. So the theater holds about 500 people. This is kind of a quick look at it when it was redone a few years ago. And of course, we also have a newly repaired curtain for the screen. This is funded by our good old friend, Jack Garner, who passed away about a year ago or so. So this is actually one of the neatest things you're going to see. This is a little video watching the screen go, or the curtain go up, I should say. And it's just one of the more, I don't know, interesting things that we do on a daily basis here. So you can watch the gold curtain kind of make its way up. The screen itself is adjustable, so we can do multiple formats for projection and motion pictures here. So originally I put this talk together for a lot of out-of-town guests, so that's why we've got some of the general introduction to what the museum looks like here. So, and there we go. And again, it's really impressive to watch this in person. Okay, just about there. So the Technology Collection is an ASME, American Society of Mechanical Engineers, historic site. We were given that designation in 2015. These designations are generally attached to bridges, dams, power plants. As far as I know, we are the only museum collection with a designation of this type. So really quite interesting there. To basically explain photography, you kind of have to go back to the origins of it. And basically what you're doing is you're trying to capture and save the image seen in the camera obscura. This is a graphic describing a room camera obscura from the 1770s. We do have a similar room at the museum. This is what it looks like. Looking, we'll get my directions correct here, west at the museum. And if you look out the window, this is what the site would look like. So when you look at this image, keep in mind, or if you're here, when you look at this, keep in mind that the image is in color and the objects actually move. So still photography was possible, introduced first because that's what they could do. To make this portable, if you would, the portable reflex handheld, or in this case, table standing camera obscura was designed. You're basically going to trace the image that you're seeing in this box. So the oldest object in the technology collection is a portable reflex camera obscura. It is currently on display on the second floor of the mansion. It dates roughly from about 1820, and this is a piece from the Cromer collection. For those of you who like wood, this is actually made out of French walnut and with a shellac finish. The earliest projector we have in the collection is this guy right here. This is a tin box, roughly 8 inches tall. The light source would have been a candle, unlike the flashlight that's in the image on the right. But it gives you an idea of how far it's going to throw an image. It's going to project an image maybe a foot or two at best. And believe it or not, itinerant lantern projectionists would take these around to show people projection in the 1830s. It was considered to be just a miracle that you could do this. The images would have been hand painted on glass. When we get into photography, this is the Giroux daguerreotype object or camera system. It was introduced to the public on August 19th, 1839, which is now World Photography Day. This is the original kit as it would have been available. Basically, we have the camera, we have the sensitizing box, we have the developing box, the holder, the plate polishing device, and the chemistry. Pretty amazing system when you get into it. Now, the original system would have been an image made on a copper plate that was coated with metallic silver on one side. It would have been cleaned, sensitized with iodine, exposed in the camera for about 15 minutes, and then processed with mercury vapor. That's going to give you a direct positive black and white image. You can see that the seal on the side of the camera is signed by Daguerre. This is his signature right there. When we get into motion pictures, really the earliest camera that we have that's kind of related to that would be the racetrack camera that was used by Edward Muybridge. Muybridge did a series of cameras in a row that would be used to photograph something along the lines of animal locomotion. So he would use about 24 cameras, I believe is what he was using. This one has number 20 stamped into the top of it. The images would look along the lines of this. So this is actually a series of still images that could be animated in a machine such as a zoetrope, which we'll see in just a minute. So the whole goal of this was trying to, aside from sorting out how to catch objects in motion, was trying to figure out what the horse's legs looked like when they were in motion. Were they ever all off the ground at one time? And you can see that that is really the case. If you look at images of horses running prior to this, they actually, the artist's conception would be that they were not all together underneath the horse. Instead, they were extended fully frontal and fully backwards. It's really kind of interesting. If you look at paintings prior to this time, they're all drawn incorrectly. So this is a zoetrope, wheel of life, if you would. It's basically about a dozen images and a dozen slots. So when you run this, you actually give it a spin, and I'll show you kind of what it looks like. This is one that we have on display here, and you'll see that the slits create something called persistence of vision, and it makes it appear that the still images are moving. And that's really how motion pictures works, at least for the earliest devices. There are other similar objects. This is the Cinematograph. Basically, very similar idea conceptually, but instead of having a drum with slits in it, we have a reflective mirror system, and the seams between the mirrors are actually what makes the object appear to move. I'll show you that in just a second here. And while we're looking at this, what you want to keep in mind is in reality, we're dealing with patents and ways of getting around patents to basically do the same thing. Patents are pretty complicated things. Depending on what country you're talking about, they may have a 9 to 10 year life, and in some cases they can be extended for an additional period. So when you see all these different early machines, aside from the creativeness of how to do this, they're also trying to get around various other inventors' patents, if you would. And this is a practice that still kind of goes on today. This device is the projecting Cinematograph. So if you take the idea of what we just looked at and add a magic lantern projector, it actually will give you a projected image of the same thing. Now, this particular version has actually two lenses. You'll see one here that has the light coming out of it. That's where the image is going to come from, actually being reflected off this mirror. It also has an opaque projector, so it actually is going to project an image of the stage out of this box. So the two images combine, and when this one runs, you'd see the little dogs jumping through the hoop, believe it or not. So to really do motion pictures as we see it today, there's one thing that's necessary, and that's flexible film. Flexible film was, in reality, the nitrate film was introduced with the Kodak in 1889. The 88 Kodak actually had Eastman's American film. That was a paperback film that was non-transparent. So the nitrate film is this guy right here. The Kodak happened to use film that was 70 millimeters wide. So when they started doing experiments on this, which you'll see in just a minute, they needed film that was longer and not quite as wide. So they took the film from the Kodak, slit it in half, and perforated it. You can see the perforations right here. And that's kind of how it works. And this on the left here is a package of Eastman transparent film, the nitrate film, for the Kodak camera. This was first used in Edison's Kinetoscope. W.K.L. Dixon was Edison's engineer who designed this. And it's interesting, they actually trademarked the name Kinetoscope in 1892 before they even had the device. So what this uses is a series of spools here of film. It's actually called a spool bank, and that is going to move amongst these spools up past this little viewing window. The kinetoscope is unusual in the fact that it does not have an intermittent. It is the only motion picture device that does not do that, or I should say device that uses film. And what it does actually, like the zoetrope, it uses a slot in a shutter. So as this slot rotates past, it gives you the same sort of sweeping motion that the zoetrope would have. The film in this particular object, according to the patent, runs up to 40 frames per second. if you do a little bit of mathematical calculations and some measurements, you'll find out that it actually runs about 24 frames per second. So the kinetoscope is currently on display in the powder peristyle upstairs. And again, gives you an idea of what's inside here. The first motion picture system is usually attributed to the Lumière Cinématographe. Auguste and Louis Lumière demonstrated this object on December 28th, 1895. And this particular object acts as both the camera, the printer, and the projector, believe it or not, so you could project film. So these are some of the parts. The film goes inside, and again, it is configured now as the camera. The take-up spool is in the top. The supply, or I should say, the supply is on the top. The take-up actually goes inside as a little black canister. And obviously, you need to have some way to rewind the film once you've done it. So that's the rewinder. This gives you an idea of how the thing works when it's being a camera. And we'll just see it's a hand crank camera. So what's really going on here is fairly complicated in a way, is that you have film being pulled down by a small finger that stops at the gate for exposure, and then it moves on to the next spot. This is what it looks like as a projector. This would be the lamp house. Uses 50 feet of film, so you're going to see about a 3-minute movie with this. This is what it looks like when it's projecting, again, hand cranked, and now you'll actually be able to see what the intermittent looks like. So again, what's happening is there's these little fingers that are reaching in and pulling the film down. It pauses for an instant and then moves on. It's basically, again, persistence of vision, intermittent. There are other machines that were designed to do this. This is the Magnascope. It was a projector that was designed to project either a loop of film as it's configured here. It could project an Edison spool bank of film, or it could actually be fitted with supply and take-up mechanisms. It's really quite an unusual device. Its intermittent is this little gizmo right here. There's a little arm and a paw that comes up here, and basically it rotates around and pauses the film in the gate. On the right-hand side here, we actually have the light source. This is a carbon arc lamp that's in the lamp house. This is a little video that shows you how the dog and paw mechanism work as it's being cranked over. So you can sort of see it gets bumped up and rotates around. And again, the goal here is to make the film just pause for just an instant in the gate for projection. Around the same time, a Swiss gentleman, Casimir Saivan, designed another system. Saivan was a Swiss watchmaker. It's basically, again, 35 millimeter. The supply is this magazine on the top. The film actually is collected in the bottom, and when it's finished, you use this brass slider here to push it into this other magazine for removal and processing. It's really quite interesting. The other unusual thing about Mr. Saivan's machine is he was the first to design a separate machine for projecting. So this is his projector head. The intermittent is this mechanism right here. It's using kind of a worm gear and a spur gear. And when you look at this, you can kind of get the idea that he might have been a Swiss watchmaker. You can actually see the numbers on the spur gear, kind of the little rollers. And when you rotate this, it actually does pause and move on to the next frame. Edison did not have a projector system. He liked his business model of paying at the door or paying per machine to view images. That model lasted a very short time. He realized that he needed to have a projector system. So instead of designing one, he actually bought the rights to the Armat Vitascope. And that's just what we have right here. This is actually serial number 2, believe it or not. The mechanism that does the intermittent on this is called a, this guy right here, it's a beater movement. So basically this little disc rotates and comes around and hits the film. It works reasonably well, but it's not actually very good for the film stuff. Our motion picture film preservation people upstairs would not like this at all. But it was used for a very short period of time. We get on to other motion picture systems. You start seeing lots of cameras appearing, especially in the New York City area. New York City was originally the hub for the motion picture industry in the US. This is a Vitagraph camera. You can see the workmanship on the outside box is really quite nice. If you like mahogany that's inlaid with brass, you'll just love this machine. In England, we have the press switch. And again, this is all about getting around people's patents to basically do the same sorts of things. So we have two external mounted film magazines that are going to hold about 400 feet of film. They're going to travel through the inside of the camera, and I'll show you what its intermittent would look like here. Really kind of interesting. And again, the goal was to get around Lumiere's patent. So we have two fingers that pivot instead of more of a sewing machine type mechanism. W.K.L. Dixon left Eastman's employment and went on to form a company called the American Mutoscope and Biograph Company. So basically, he was aware of Edison's patents on the kinetoscope, and he designed a machine that would get around all of them. So they had a camera that would actually use unperforated film and would perf the film after the image was made. That was one way of making the image. This playback system was a mutoscope. This is a tabletop mutoscope. It was probably a demonstration machine used by the Mutoscope and Biograph Company. And basically, they would print their film onto individual pieces of paper mounted in a drum, sort of like a flip book, if you would. And the more better known ones are the ones that you see in amusement parks, or something like this. This is the cast iron mutoscope. You'll see all of his patent numbers on the bottom of the tag on the right there. And this is how that works, believe it or not. It's got a little card flipper system. So as you crank the handle, this little finger here holds the card back just long enough for it to flip. So this is a little bit of a Felix the Cat mutoscope with the door open, by the way. What it would look like through the viewing window is something like this. And just to confuse things up, I'm giving you a little bit of a Tom Mix video. But again, it's a flip card machine with a magnifying viewer and illumination. So it looks kind of like motion pictures. And these were popular in amusement parks in the, through the 1920s or so. Some of the ones lingered a little bit longer. We have a pretty good collection of mutoscopes. And for those nerds who want to know, it uses 755 cards with images on them, and each reel actually has alternating blank cards. So there's more like 1,500 cards per reel on this. Back to more Hollywood things, we get the Pathé Cinematograph. Pathé is a French company. The Cinematograph here is something along the lines of cameras that were used by companies such as the ones that Charlie Chaplin founded. It's basically very similar to the Lumière Cinématographe, but basically bigger. And by this time, apparently Lumiere's patent had expired because it's basically the identical mechanism, although it's a little bit bigger. In this case, it does hold about 400 feet of film. Again, hand crank device, cranked from the back. This gives you an idea of what's going on here. So the spinning disc would be the shutter. There's a slit in the shutter. And again, the film is being pulled down by this mechanism right here. Sound sync motion pictures are much older than most people realize. This is the Elgéphone by Gaumont in Paris, 1906. So this was sound sync motion pictures done in 1906. The sound was recorded onto a disc, believe it or not. So it's a hand crank machine that would synchronize, again, sound with movies. The speakers for this system would be these two horns here. And so that's the Gaumont Elgéphone. Other Hollywood cameras, probably one of the more famous ones in the museum is the William DeBry camera that was used by Charles Rocher, who happened to be Mary Pickford's favorite cameraman. She actually signed this camera in pencil on the top. Again, hand crank camera. It's a coaxial machine. So you're going to have a supply and take up that live behind these doors, again, for 400 feet of film. Chicago was the next stop for the motion picture industry. Bell and Howell designed a number of cameras. Probably the earliest one that we know of is the Bell and Howell, what's called the black box. This is serial number 8. You can see it stamped right in the front of the lens panel. Internal magazine. It's again hold two boxes of film 400 feet in length. In England, we have the Moyen Basti 35. From a mechanical standpoint, this is really quite interesting. It uses a chain drive system to crank over the shutter. Its intermittent is actually this little gizmo right here. It's a shaft with a little slot that's been milled in it. Really nice finished woodwork, by the way. And in operation, it looks like this. And again, if you like machines, this is probably going to be your favorite. It reminds me of how a locomotive works. Casimir Przynski designed a machine that actually had a compressed power. It actually used compressed air. This is a motion picture camera system. The compressed air was provided with this bicycle pump or this air pump. And in use, the compressed air would be stored in these brass cylinders. And when you crank it over or turn it on, it looks like this. Now I'm hand cranking this here. I didn't want to risk putting air in the cylinders, but this is what that looks like in motion. The concept of using compressed air to run a motion picture camera is just fascinating to me. I would love, if possible, to sit down and have a chat with this gentleman sometime. Now we're going to look at a little projecting. So Sigmund Lubin was an early pioneer in motion pictures from Philadelphia. Unfortunately, from what I understand, all of his motion pictures were lost in a fire in a warehouse. But he made a hand crank projector. So the projectionist would actually have to rotate this handle here. I've actually run this machine for about 30 minutes or so during the Nitrate Picture Show a couple of years ago. It uses a Geneva cam intermittent mechanism. And how that works is there's a little pin on this round shaft that goes into these little star slots. They're called the Geneva cam. It's kind of like how a watch works. And we'll show you what that looks like in operation. Kind of neat. Now, the one thing to keep in mind, and I found this out while doing it, when you're hand cranking motion pictures, one would think you'd crank at a steady rate, and that would be ideal, but you actually have to match the rate that the cameraman did at the time. So you really have to watch the film and kind of make it run at what looks like the correct speed. It's a little challenging, I will say. Back to Chicago, we have the Bell & Howell 2709 standard. This was basically the beginnings of the external Mickey Mouse ears type design film magazine. These, again, 400 feet of film. This camera was designed in 1912, and these were used really up into the 1970s, believe it or not. This is a fairly early one. The only real difference with the early cameras versus the later ones is the finish. This one has a shiny black paint. The later ones have more of a crackle finish. You'll see that it does have a hand crank on the side. That is just for loading. These actually could be motorized. Also from Chicago is the Selig standard camera, Shustak. What's interesting of Shustak and Selig, they were actually the first studio to move to California, to move to Hollywood. And this was a camera that they took with them, apparently. Gaumont designed a color motion picture system that actually used a single strip of black and white film that was exposed and projected through red, green, and blue filters. I ran one of these many, many years ago, and it has color. Now, you have to keep in mind this is 1912, so you're not going to have panchromatic film. When we think of color films, we sort of think of Technicolor. This by no means was that. It had color film, but I wouldn't say it was color of nature. Now, the other thing that's interesting about this, and I found this out due to experience, you actually have an option to adjust the color filters. Well, what that does was when you project it back, you have to make it align and match what was done in the camera. So you end up getting a little bit of color fringing with these. They tend to be little clips of, say, 30 seconds long or so. So you get the first clip aligned, and then the next clip will be out of alignment again. So it'll be a little bit fringy on that. But again, 1912, it was what they had at the time. We do have one SNA Chicago camera in the collection, says so right on the box. Unfortunately, the box itself is empty inside. So somebody at some point took the mechanism out. So I have no idea what they're using inside. I do find it interesting that we have the camera with nothing inside. So there you go. Akeley, the Akeley camera. Carl Akeley actually was from Rochester, New York. He would end up moving to New York City, working for the Natural History Museum, and he wanted to design a system that could actually pan wild animals running in Africa. So he designed this system, and there's a couple things that's interesting about it. First of all, you'll notice this little gyro on the side. That's actually a geared system to allow you to make smooth movements. There's one on the camera, also one mounted on the tripod that would hook onto these little levers right here. He used a 200-foot magazine that they claimed could be loaded into the camera in something on the order of 5 seconds. He must load things faster than I do. His intermittent mechanism is really quite interesting. It's this little lever here that rotates around. So I'll just show you that here in a second. It's quite a unique system. These cameras were ended up using in Hollywood for any movie that had anything moving where they're trying to pan things. This would be the camera of choice. The Willett Professional is made in New Rochelle, New York City. It's basically almost a one-on copy of the Pathé Cinematograph, except this one is made out of all metal and not wood, not mahogany. Again, patents. This is a Mitchell standard, comes out of 1920. Very similar in some ways to the Bell and Howell, except it does one thing that the Bell and Howell does not do. It has what we call a rack over focusing system. You can actually turn this little handle here and move the viewfinder right to the film area, so you can get very accurate focusing when you're making motion pictures, which would be very important to have. These cameras were used again by the professional studios. What's really different between Mitchell and companies like Technicolor and Panavision is Mitchell actually sold their cameras. Technicolor and Panavision leased them. So again, Panavision and Technicolor still exist. Mitchell does not. So I guess leasing was the better idea in this case. Speaking of Technicolor, this is a two-color Technicolor camera, 1925 or so. Technicolor was actually introduced originally in 1918. Various systems. What they were doing is taking a single strip of black and white film and photographing it through these colored prisms, and then they had numerous printing systems that would provide the color. Now this is again not color of nature, but it does have color. If you go back to the time, if you know a little about motion pictures, they actually would hand tint or hand color frame. So this is a way of trying to more getting into the more accurate and not having to all do it by hand. So more larger production, if you would. The three-strip system was introduced in 1932. This is a Model D camera. It's actually number 14. It would have been made until about 1939 or so. And three-strip Technicolor is really quite interesting. So what they're doing is they've got 3 rolls of black and white film that are exposed in the camera through cyan, yellow, and magenta filters. And then in processing, they would actually add the colors to it. So, and this becomes the sort of the classic Technicolor, very accurate color systems used on movies like The Wizard of Oz, things like that type. So that's the Model D. We acquired this camera from Technicolor in 1965. About 10 years ago, one of my colleagues, Ed Stratman, and I went out to Technicolor in California to acquire the rest of their archive. Part of that collection is on display upstairs in the peristyle. It's the collection of color dye samples. This particular camera is, as it's seen right now, is a Technorama camera. That's a widescreen camera. The camera is marked G2. It's kind of kooky when you get into serial numbers on these sorts of things. For some reason or other, Technicolor made cameras in lots of 7. So this, when it was first made, it would have been Technicolor model D2, not G2. And it would have been actually used on The Wizard of Oz, because basically that was the cameras that they had at the time. Well, in the 1960s, of the 28 cameras that they had made, they converted 11 of them to a widescreen process called Technorama. So this got turned into a widescreen camera. So now it's using Eastman color negative film in these coaxial magazines that actually travel the long way through the camera. They just wanted a bigger box. And the last movie that I know of that this particular camera was used on was the original Star Wars movie. We actually have one of the cameramen, Richard Edlund, up in the corner there. You can see him using this particular camera in a scene from Star Wars. This particular camera was shipped to us in basically unassembled in pieces. So I got to sit down and with a number of my colleagues and figure out how to put it together. We ran into a little bit of a conundrum, as we had no way to drive the film magazine. They had a couple different ways to do it. It was unclear how they had done it with this camera. You could either use the motor that was with the camera to drive the film, or they had a separate one that would sit right up here. So we sort of decided, saying we didn't get the other motor and they didn't have one, that it must have used this extra little shaft. So I had a local machinist make me a part so we could run it this way. It was kind of a fun project. It was also fun having Richard Edlund call me. He was actually in Japan at the time. So it was always good to talk to him. He's a really good guy. Mentioned Panaflex. This is the latest of the professional motion picture cameras we have in the collection. This is a Panaflex Gold. It would have been introduced about 1976. I had been after Panavision to get us a camera for many, many years. And finally, they decided that they would ship us one in 2014, which I thought was really neat. Then it occurred to me the reason they were sending it to us is they were no longer using it. They weren't leasing it. So apparently it's sort of in some ways a demise of a time period, if you would. So this is currently on display also in the powder peristyle. We get into some really interesting things here now. We're getting into amateur movies. Frederick Barnes was an engineer in Eastman Kodak company, and he first started experimenting with a handheld amateur motion picture system. So what's interesting about this camera, if you look at the spool up here, you'll see it looks like it's wide enough to hold 35mm film. That's because that's really what it was designed to do. However, if you look at the exposure gate, it's half that size. So basically, this is the camera that determined how big 16mm film would be. Hand crank camera, and it's a little confusing. You'll see a date inside here, 1934. That actually is a date when it was shipped over to Eastman Kodak Company's patent museum. The camera itself actually would have been built in 1914. The next prototype was by Julien Tessier, and this is again 16mm 1920 hand crank camera, 50 feet. And there's a couple interesting things about this. First of all, if you look at the magazine, you look at the box wasn't quite big enough to hold 50 feet of film, so they had to mill a little bit out of it after it had already been manufactured. And what I find really interesting is the hand penciled in dates and what it was used for on the inside. So you can see that this camera was first tested on April 21st, 1920. Now, George Eastman was quite involved in the design of amateur motion picture equipment. So he had a say as to what would happen. He wanted the camera to be bigger than that. He wanted it to hold 100 feet of film, not 50 feet of film. So this is the second of the Tessier models, and it's taller to accommodate more film. And if you know a little bit about cameras, you'll say, boy, that really looks kind of like a Graflex SLR that Eastman Kodak Company was making at the time. And that's probably because they still own Graflex at that time. The handle and the leatherwork are very typical of Graflex. This is the last of the Tessier prototypes. Now they've switched over to an aluminum body, very similar to what the production camera would look like. There is one slight change here. This camera has a hinged door to load the film in. Mr. Eastman did not like this idea. He was convinced that the hinges would break. And in fact, the lower hinge on this particular camera did break. So it was a good idea. This particular camera, however, was used to make the first edited 16mm motion picture called Out of the Fog. You can actually see the cameraman Harris Tuttle on site using that particular camera to make the film. This would be the first frame of Out of the Fog. It's basically a spoof on how motion picture film came to be. It's kind of an amusing thing. We do have it up on our website if you want to look at it. So this is the first production of the Cine-Kodak. Came out in 1923. We're coming up on its 100th anniversary. The first model is fairly easy to identify. It has this hinged door lens cover. It also only has one eye-level viewfinder. Most of the later models have a twin lens, and it is a hand crank camera. You can see the hand crank right here. It's the only hand crank motion picture camera made by Eastman Kodak Company. This is what its mechanism looks like. I've opened the gate here so you can actually see the intermittent claws coming down. The other interesting thing about this camera is it has this weighted flywheel in the front. It makes it a lot easier to crank at an even speed. With the Ciné-Kodak came Eastman's safety film. This is for 50 and 600 feet lengths. The Ciné-Kodak actually was a complete system. So it was the camera, projector, editor, and the screen. The cost of the system was about half of a Model T automobile at that time, so about $225. This particular projector, by the way, is serial number 4, and it's the only one that I have ever seen that has covered motion picture cans, which was more typically done for nitrate film. So even though they had safety film and they had never really planned on not using safety film, they still built the projector as if it might have been a nitrate machine. The editor is quite interesting also. Again, the whole idea that you're going to script and edit your home movies was what the whole plan was for the Cine-Kodak project. The next model in the line is the Cine-Kodak Model B. This is a spring wound motor camera. The crank on the side is used to wind it up. You can see it has an eye level finder and a waist level finder. This particular one is fitted with a, rather fast f1.9 lens. And really the other interesting thing about the Model B, it was the first to use Eastman's Kodachrome safety film. So if you track back to 1912 when Eastman Kodak Company established their research labs, was done for basically 2 reasons. One was to sort out some of the early issues that they had in making motion or just film in general. And the second part of it was for color film. They figured the company that, and this is actually an interview with George Eastman, the company that figured out color film would actually own the next century. So this is unusual, even though the Kodachrome name is something that would survive. This is actually a black and white film that had little tiny lenses. They call it lenticular film, and it would be exposed through these filters. So this is the taking lens that would be inserted into the camera that we see, and you can see it's a red, green, and blue filter, and it would be projected back through the same filters, and it would give you a color experience, if you would. And that was the only color that Mr. Eastman saw in his lifetime. Was the lenticular Kodacolor. This is actually a photograph of Thomas Edison and George Eastman at the house here at the introduction party for lenticular Kodacolor on July 30th, 1928. Mr. Eastman is holding a Cine-Kodak Model B in his hands right there. This is a Kodachrome Model B projector that was actually also designed to use lenticular Kodacolor. You can tell right off the bat because it has this little indexing mark here. That's what lines the filter up correctly. I have this sitting next to what I believe is the design study for the mechanical parts inside. You can see that the lens is on the same plane here, the shutter. So they're actually designing the gearing system that's actually going to be inside this projector. Now, granted, it is turned backwards, so you can't quite see it, but it does show that they line up together. You'll also notice that this is the early 16mm film that was double perforated on both, perfed on both edges. To lower the price, and unfortunately, when you get into some of this stuff, some of it has to do with timing in the economy. Needless to say, the stock market didn't do well in 1929, so they realized they had to make a less expensive camera. So they came out with the Cine-Kodak 8. So the film is half the size, although that's a little misleading, but it's the 8 Model 20, much smaller camera. So what 8mm motion pictures does, in some ways, a lot like that earlier Barnes camera. It uses 16mm film. You expose half of it, turn it over and do the other side. And when they process it, they actually slit it in half. So that's the Cine-Kodak 8 Model 20. Again, these items, many of which have come from Eastman Kodak Company, what they actually took these right off the production line and set them aside, and eventually gave that collection to the George Eastman House when it was opened in 1949. So some of these things are just in amazing condition, never handled. The Cine 8 also had an editing kit. This is kind of a folding suitcase, if you would. So you can have the supply, editing, and splicing kit down here. And again, the condition is just unbelievable. The two little bottles, by the way, are a film cleaner and a film cement. So you're actually gonna glue them together, if you would, in this particular area there. The Cine Special comes out in 1933, would have stayed in production into 47 or so. This is a 16mm camera, kind of a professional camera. NFL films like the Cine Special, very Art Deco design if you like Walter Darwin Teague. Kodachrome. This is the kind of the culmination of early color film. This is very similar to what would end up being used in still film. It's the first multi-layered film. Now, Kodachrome is actually a multi-layered black and white film with multiple filtering layers. So it's a 6-layer film, 3 emulsions, 3 filters, and the color was added later. So it's, again, for cyan, yellow, and magenta. From a design study collection that we have here, again, with the Kodak collection came a number of their design models. This is the Fritz and Darwin Teague design model for a slot loading 8. This projector did not go into production. However, this case design was patented, believe it or not. So it's a design patent that would be used in the Cine Sound Special. So it's the same size, or I should say the same design, but quite a bit larger in size, and would include an amplifier. But most people have not seen the slot load 8. And another of the just incredible condition 8mm is the Kodak 8 model 80. This one looks like it was made yesterday. I mean, the condition is unbelievable. Even the packaging for the lamp is in practically mint condition. And again, these are things that were taken right off the production line and set aside and eventually donated to the museum here. In the non-Kodak collection, we do have items by many companies around the world. This is the Bolex H16 Reflex. One of the more popular cameras used by burgeoning filmmakers, I guess is the best way to put it, and or serious filmmakers too. 16 is quite good. It has a turret lens, so you can actually rotate it around to change the lenses. From the projector era from the 60s, we've got the Instamatic M80. This can project both 8mm and Super 8. That's why it's called Dual 8. Super 8 and 8 are actually the same size film. They found out in the middle 60s that if you relocated the perforation, you can actually make a slightly bigger picture. So in my camera store days, this is the one that we rented more than anything else. These are pretty much bulletproof and very easy to use. They fold, easy to transport, really a very well-designed projector. The Kodak Pageant 16 sound projector, those of us of a certain school age will remember looking at sound movies when we were in grade school, maybe junior high school. This was probably the projector that was used for them. The classic brown case is the older style. What's really interesting about this gets into one of my good friends, Brad Paxton, was hired by Eastman Kodak Company to redesign the amplifier for this particular projector. This had a tube amp. He turned it into transistors. And the reason they wanted to redesign the amp, apparently, and I can actually speak from experience because I got to move one of these when I was about in 5th grade. They were pretty heavy. They're really too heavy for most teachers to move at that time. Sound 8mm. This is Super 8 Sound Sankyo, 1975. It's sound is sound on film basically. It's a little handheld machine. Really quite an elegant little camera. We get into a little bit of video here. So this is the beginning of the Ikegami Betacam stuff, the sorts of things that TV stations would use. That we got this one actually from WXXI a number of years ago. Something that the cameraman would get to carry on his shoulder. I'm sure with the digital, they're certainly less heavy than they were then. And last but not least, we have the Kodavision Series 8. This came out in 1985. I remembered this when I was working in the camera store, going back home. And so it's an 8mm system, camera and playback unit. So that kind of draws us to the close of where we are thus far with this particular collection. The cataloging project will continue for another year or so, maybe two, depending on how long it takes to go through the things. It's been kind of an eye-opening experience getting to see the sorts of things that we have here that we didn't know that we had. So on that, I will close it out. And if anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Thank you so much, Todd. That was excellent and a good reminder even to staff of the diverse, fabulous objects in our collection. So you mentioned that we've still got at least a year, possibly more left on this work. Out of the 1,400 objects to be digitized and cataloged, how many would you say we have done at this point?
Okay, we actually just did a head count for the year-end report. So if I remember correctly, we have cataloged, wait a minute, I actually have the numbers written down here. So
this isn't staged either. You're just ready to go. I love it.
We're still there. Actually, they're probably working on it right now as we speak. I think we've got, we've done about 600 cameras have been cataloged, and the head count on the image is a little more complicated because we're actually doing 10 or so views of each object. So we've shot 10,678 objects or images, and I think we're just about 1,000 items have been photographed and about 600 cataloged if you get into it.
Fabulous. And in terms of, I mean, the entire point or a large point of this work is to make these objects available to the masses, for them to be available online. Are we going to be waiting until the entire digitization and cataloging process is completed before these objects are kind of available for perusal by the masses on our website, or has that process of getting them out there already begun?
It goes in batches. I mean, basically we're making, obviously anything that's cataloged is available right now. And as far as the images goes, it usually takes about a week or so, I think, from what I remember, between the time that Ira photographs it before it actually goes up on our website. So we're basically creating very high resolution images of these items for our own storage system in our for our network here, and then we're putting up basically screen resolution size online, but about the same of what we're looking at here. So yeah, we're trying to make them available as soon as we can, but again, they do have to be processed through and connected up with the objects.
Of course. And we've got a question here from Thomas who says, and I love this question, what object would you like to acquire that is not currently in the GEM collection?
Oh, the infamous, what would we like?
What do we want?
My current what? I just heard Glenn across the hall say, uh-oh. You know, it's an interesting question, because what usually shows up is I'm interested in things that I don't know anything about. Mm-hmm. So anything that I've never seen before that I don't know exist. The collection is really kind of hard to explain. You have to understand that, and I find this actually kind of hard to explain. Eastman Kodak Company, aside from putting aside one of all of their products, they also bought everybody else's. So when it comes to historic things, this is a fairly complete collection. If you look at the various catalog books that the motion picture folks have put out over the years, we pretty much have all that stuff. But there's things out there that we just don't know about. And occasionally we do come across things along the lines of, well, like that design model for the Kodachrome Model B that we didn't know that existed. So a lot of what we're looking for, we probably have, believe it or not. We just haven't had the time or the staffing to really inventory it. I don't know if that's a really good answer, but that's kind of where we are when it comes to this particular collection. Obviously, when it comes to newer things, I'd love to have a red camera, something that's currently out there, because we are currently doing that. They're not easy to come by, and they're very expensive. But anything that's newer than our 1978 Panavision camera would be a wonderful addition to the collection.
Excellent. All right. Well, I think that just about does it. I want to say thank you to Todd for that excellent overview, and to all of our members for joining us and for your support. And as I mentioned, we will be sending a link to the recording of this program to everybody that registered for this event. And when it's ready, probably in a week or so, it'll be available in perpetuity on our members only Vimeo page. So you can watch it again or share it as you see fit. So thank you again to everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day.